So last week we talked about initiative, and this week around I want to present what I've been working on since that video last week. A new initiative system that takes a lot of ideas from everything else. Now, what are the main problems with most initiatives systems today? Right? Either they're too loose or they're too strict and they create certain problems. Combat takes too long. Players are waiting too much in between turns, which means they get disconnected from play. You will see they start checking on their phones, and if you play virtually, you have literally no way of knowing what they could be doing in the meantime. They could get up from their computer, start making coffee, because they know that it might take 5 minutes or sometimes even 10 minutes for it to get back to their turn. Right? Those playing RPGs regularly, I know how much this is true. Sometimes it can literally take 10 minutes between it gets back to your turn. And if you're playing a character or a system that doesn't particularly have any ways of interacting in between turns, then you'll be end up waiting for a long time. Now, what are the other possibilities here? We have a major issue also, even if a system may have reactions, is that there is little you can do to intervene in other players' actions. So it is completely okay for someone to leave the table or the desk for 10 minutes because they know, oh, not that much is going to change. And what other players or characters will do is maybe they will deal damage. That's not going to change drastically what I will have to do when it comes around to my turn. So the amount of impact on how much it changes the state of combat is not enough for players to have to pay attention all the time. And another thing is choice paralysis. So if you've ever played a system like, let's say, Dungeons and Dragons, which, especially in its modern iterations, has a list of hundreds upon hundreds of spells, and you start to see a huge difference between the person who's playing the fighter, who would just move, attack, 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 for example, and they already know what they're going to do. I guess it's the complete opposite of the spectrum, where what they do every turn never changes, and then you have someone who plays a spellcaster, and they have 100 spells to consider, and especially if they're not familiar with the system, which I found, unfortunately, a lot of new players feel very drawn to playing a spellcaster despite the huge learning curve. And so these players will take the longest because they have choice paralysis. They look at all their spells and they have no clue which one to pick. And then going to the next point, they might they might be in a situation where they will then ask for advice, which, yes, it's good, but also it's not a desirable behavior because it just keeps dragging on the combat for even longer. Now, what are some of the situations, some of the solutions that we can come up with for these problems? We can reduce the amount of rolls. So what a lot of systems do is they combine the attack roll and the damage roll. So you don't even roll to hit anymore. It's just either it's the same roll, so there's still a chance of missing, but it's baked into the damage roll, or you completely remove the chance to hit or miss and you use armor and dodging in different ways. The amount of math you do, so instead of maybe doing 52 damage and the monster has 7 resistance to that damage and you need to do the math, or you have to combine 4 different rolls into your attack. You have 18 plus 32 plus 17 and 8. And you have to do this math. So reduce, where you reduce the numbers, so perhaps the monsters have less HP, but also you do less damage, and everything is streamlined. So that also quickens the game. And the amount of resolutions. What are resolutions? It's you're waiting for your counterparty to respond to you. For example, I rolled a 17. does it hit? So you're asking your game master, does it hit? And then the game master, or you have to ask about states. Hey, game master, does this monster have cover? Hey, game master, am I flanking? Do I get advantage on this? Is it disadvantage? And all these questions, the more resolutions there are, the more you can substitute this with back and forth. The more back and forths there are, the more time will be wasted. So ideally, you want whatever properties. So imagine this. You have cover in D&D 5e. Cover changes your AC. So you have to ask the game master, and there is this moment because you're doing the attack roll, it has to be accounted for the AC, into the AC. Whereas if there were no attack rolls and you would fold the cover into perhaps some damage resistance, if you have half cover, you just reduce every instance of damage by 1. Then you don't need the attack roll. You can just fold it into the damage. So there's ways to reduce these resolutions, these back and forth between the other party and whoever is doing the action. Now, other solutions to players waiting too much in between their turns. We're going to deep dive into this in this video. Is splitting up the turn. You think about systems that have maybe 3 actions, or movement, action, bonus action, which is just like 3 actions as well, more or less. Or just movement, action, these kind of things. You split it up. So if you have a system like Pathfinder 2nd edition where you have 3 actions, imagine if you could only ever take your 1 action at a time. So you take one of your actions and then it goes to the next player. That way it's broken up and the time in between turns. So now instead of having 10 minutes to make your coffee, well, you might not get up from your desk to make your coffee because it's only going to take 1 minute for it to get back to my turn. So I'm more invested. It's happening. It will feel much quicker, even though, let's say a round took 10 minutes and now the round still takes 10 minutes. But now you're just not waiting as much in between your actions. Here we have the same thing. The fact of splitting up these actions helps players to react. So if before you were going to move, attack, and so on, it's all in one chunk. But let's say because you have to do all of your actions in one turn, all of them at once, you don't have the ability as much to react to what's happening on the battlefield. So you move and you attack because that's the state during your turn. But it turns out that right after you play, one of your friends got knocked out. So now you can't react because you used all of your actions. Well, if you split up all the actions throughout the round, you would have just moved, you'd have seen your companion go down, and now you'd be able to provide first aid or whatever is applicable in your system. Choice paralysis, quite simple. You want to reduce the number of choices players have, but have every choice be impactful. So it's not, I have 100 different spells, and every of these spells does 1d10 damage, and maybe they have different damage types, but most of the time it doesn't really matter because these monsters don't have resistance to that kind of damage. So it's just about flavor. So you want to reduce the choices where, hey, maybe you just have like an energy blast. It's just one spell, but you can flavor it however you like. It just does 1d10 damage, and it's just this one spell. But when there are different options, you want to enhance the mechanical impact. So that it's not just, do I want to do 8d6 or 6d8? Oh no, let me compute the math. Which one is more optimal? It feels like a lot of spells are just 8d6 or whatever, or 10d5, the 4 of something, and it doesn't feel like an impactful choice. At the end, you just identify whichever one has the most optimal dice, and you go with that one all the time. That's why there's memes about wizards casting Fireball all the time. And lastly, the last problem, we have backseat driving at the table. Those armchair admirals. What do we do about it? Well, you could consider having players have to commit to the action before it is revealed. Now that's tricky to implement physically on a VTT. Virtually, it's easier to implement because you have players inputting an action into your VTT of choice. And you'd have to design the system, obviously, but they would have to input their action, and then once the game master unpauses, it resolves the action. So that way, there's no way for players to be like, hold on, do you think this is a good idea? Do you think? Well, no, it's too late. You've done your move. How to implement this at the table? You could have a system where you have different cards that broadly group actions. So you could have, a spell card, an attack card, a help card, or a move card, these kinds of broad groups of actions. And then you put your card face down. And then when the game master says it's ready, you flip around your card and say, oh, I committed to a move action, or I committed to an attack action. And then you see what that looks like. Now, let us go into a little hex grid here that I've prepared to show how this would look like. So in a system where you'd have 20 initiative, and initiative would be a resource that would decrement every time you do something. You could have an optional rule, let's say for armor, where you start with less, but otherwise we'll just pretend everybody is the same. So you all start with 20 initiative. Now, at the beginning of the round, when it's the first round of combat, everyone has the same initiative. So this is where you could do the thing that we talked about earlier, where you have players commit beforehand. So players think about what they want to do, and then everything is revealed at once. And then now you have to check who has got the action that costs the least initiative. So if we have a system where moving one hex or one square costs 1 initiative, then you'd always resolve the lowest cost first. That way there is a strategic choice. Because obviously the actions that cost the least are the least impactful, but they're also the ones that get resolved first. So if you had an attack, for example, that, I don't know, had like 10 initiative cost, you would go after the person who decided to move 3 hexes because they cost only 3. Now, in this situation, we have 5 players and they all decide to move. So which one would get to play first? It would be the cost of 1. How would you resolve this at a table if you don't have a VTT? You just do it the classical style where you ask about the initiative. So instead of asking who rolled this or that on the initiative, you know that you don't roll for initiative anymore. Everybody starts with 20. You just ask, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, and for what actions players have taken. So 1, if someone speaks up, yes, I have a 1 action, so they get to go first. They will move 1 hex, and then we'll resolve the 2 and the 3 and the 4. Now, what happens then in the initiative? So in the initiative, let's say this is player 1 that moves 1 hex. You will have to move them down on the initiative. So now they have 19. However, let's say if player 2 is this one, they move 3 hexes, then they would be at 17. Now, let's pretend all of these players got to go. How would you resolve the next round of combat? Or not? Well, it would still be the same round. The next go. Now that everybody that used to be at 20 got to go, we simply move on to the next order of initiative. So at 19, this player would get to go again. So then we go back to our example here in the hex grid. They could choose whatever they want to do, move, attack, and you could design your system a different initiative cost for all actions. So for example, if you'd only want people to be able to attack once a turn no matter what, then you could say that, oh, attacking always costs at least 11 initiative. That way you could never have 2 attacks, right? You could balance it that way. And you could have, for example, difficult terrain. If you wanted to implement difficult terrain in your system, you could increase the cost. If you want to, you could balance everything. So instead of, for example, movement 1 hex costing 1, you could have 1 hex costing 2. That way you reduce the amount of movement players have each round, but it gives you more freedom to balance things. So for example, if you're hasted, then it might cost only 1, right? So you halve the cost. But if it's difficult terrain, you might increase the cost. So then it might cost 3 or 4. There's a lot of vectors for you to balance things out. And so when a character would be slowed or stunned or whatnot, you could simply apply that through increasing the initiative cost of your actions. So it could be, oh, you're slowed 1. Well, all of your actions would cost 1 more initiative than they normally would. You go on like this until all players have exhausted all of their initiative. So until they get to 0. Now, granted, sometimes you will not be able to go all the way to 0, but then a player might voluntarily end their round. So let's say you are a player that is left at 2 initiative, and you're done playing. You could say, well, I'm ending my round because there's nothing really interesting for me to do with that costs 2 initiative or less. So I'm just going to voluntarily end my round, and then you will put yourself down there. So the round is over, and once everyone is finished using up all of their initiative, you reset everything back to the top, and you start over again. Now, what happens in case of a tie? So let's say you have 2 players that decide to go for the same thing. They both do 1 action, and that means that the next time around, they're both at 19 initiative. What do you do? Well, you have your tiebreaker system. That means so you could have here, it would, for example, indicate their current initiative order. So that would be 19 for them. So instead of 6, well, let's actually put them at 6 so that we have the perfect example. So let me go down to 6. So they are both at 6. How would you resolve that? Well, they are currently at 6. Now, what is the next tiebreaker? It is the previous action, because you always want to encourage the smallest actions get to go first, right? And of course, the more powerful actions will cost more, but then you will always be at a disadvantage when it comes to acting first. You could imagine a really powerful spell like Meteor Swarm being 20 initiative. So it will take all of your initiative, but you will get to go last. You could even have a system where some really powerful spells only get resolved once it gets to the other side of the initiative. What does that mean is, let's say you have, in this example, a really powerful spell of Meteor Swarm that would cost 20 initiative, but it gets only resolved at the end. So once it returns to the same place. So if you have 20 initiative, you would drop all the way to the bottom. That means it would only get resolved at 0. That could be a way to balance things out. Now, if you have spells that are not that powerful but still costly, they could be resolved on the initiative rather than at the end. So here we have, back to the tiebreaker, 6 is their current initiative, 1 is the action, the cost of the previous action. So since they had moved 1, both of them, it is 1. then this is optional. If you have a system that uses ability scores and statistics, you could have an ability score like agility, dexterity, speed, reflex, that kind of thing. So you could implement that into the tiebreaker. So the player who is faster or has more reflex or is more agile gets to then go before the others. And lastly, if all things are the same, this is optional, right? If you had two players having exactly the same thing, they took the same action before, they have the same speed stat, they have the same everything, then you can just roll for it to see who gets to go first. You just have a basic roll. You can have any dice you want. Of course, the bigger the die, the less chance there is of tying once again. So, for example, you could just roll a d20 because it's a big dice, and it's usually the biggest dice that is readily available. It's hard to find, a D24 or a D30, or even, a D100. Because a D100 most of the time is just 2D10. So you just roll a D20 and see who rolls higher. And of course, if by some miracle they still roll the same, then you just keep rolling until, they are not have the same roll anymore. All right, so this is how you can break the ties, how you do the initiative. And I'm going to keep iterating on that and probably implement that into my own systems, because I genuinely believe that this will solve a lot of issues that we are currently facing. One of the big issues I'm still dedicated to working on is just overall combat taking too long. This solution of an initiative system does act on all the other vectors, but I do think that combat taking a long time is a really tricky problem, in that this initiative system doesn't really tackle this as much as it does shortening the time in between actions, right? So if we read this little blurb here that I wrote, it is much harder to reduce the overall duration of combat, which this one might do a little bit, but not that much, than it is to reduce the time between, I meant to say, two player actions, right? The hypothesis is that a large uninterrupted waiting period is more harmful to player engagement than several smaller waiting periods, even if some of those periods is equal in duration to the larger, right? So meaning if your round previously was 10 minutes, and now with this new initiative system, your round is still 10 minutes, it will at least be more interesting for your players, because it is broken up so much and you have so much control about when you're going to play next. And also what this affords is this system doesn't need reactions anymore. Because if you want to quote unquote react, you will get to react once it gets back to your initiative, but you can control. So if you want to always be able to be more reactive, you just take small actions. You just take action that costs 2 or 3 every time, and you will always be able to react to whatever's happening. But that way, you can fold in reactions, what I was talking about last week, into your action system, streamlining even more things than before. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on this system. Maybe there's some crowdsourcing we can do on iterating. And if you know any systems that already use this, I would love to read about them